I'm ready. We are live on the BS3 Sports Show. So appreciate you for calling in once again. We have Matt DiBiase on the show. How's it going?
Pretty good, Ben. Pretty good.
So had the opportunity to read the book. Once again, he is the author of the book entitled The Art of the Dealers, the NHL's Greatest General Managers. Was released October 23rd of last year. And definitely an intriguing book, something that I'm thankful that you sent to me and I was able to read through it. But I wanted to ask you, what made you want to write a book about this topic?
Well, Ben, no one has ever really done, people have done books on analytics about players, about managers and coaches, but no one has ever tried to do a book on analytics on general managers. Yes, there have been bios on general managers in the various four major sports. There have been memoirs and all that, but no one has ever attempted to rate and rank the top 50 general managers in one of the four major sports, be it baseball, football, basketball, or NHL hockey. It's never been done before. It's literally a groundbreaking work, the first of its kind. Imagine if someone wrote an equivalent book about baseball general managers or the NFL general managers or even NBA general managers. It was totally groundbreaking. Like my first book, Bench Bosses, which rated and ranked the 50 greatest NHL head coaches of all time. No one had ever done that before. And I was following in its footsteps. So I was breaking new ground in the terms of broadening the envelope of sports history.
Right, definitely. And yeah, I agree with you. I haven't seen a book of this on this particular topic ever, especially with general managers. And a lot of times general managers get overlooked. They get praised when they make big signings, but they get hated if they don't make a signing or if they do something that the overall fan or the team may not agree with. But in your book, it really breaks down what the general manager does, what they're responsible for. So share some of the things that the general manager actually does. So I think a lot of people don't even know that.
Well, we all know the old sports cliche, we would have won, but we didn't have the horses. Well, the person who's responsible for bringing the horses to a team, whether it be baseball, football, hockey, or basketball, or any other sport, is the general manager. And in hockey, they along with their staff, make the draft picks, they make the trades, they do the free agent signings, and it's the art form is getting those right players and right personalities to your team that can help your team, win, excel, and, hopefully win the Stanley Cup. And that's an art form that belongs to a precious few. And that's what my book identifies, those 50 very special individuals who help make their teams great by signing some of the greatest hockey players that ever played the game. Either drafting them or trading for them or signing them as free agents. And these are the men who built some of the greatest dynasties in NHL history. And I got to talk to some of the great active ones in the game today. Lou Lamoriello, who's the head of the Toronto Maple Leafs. I talked to Doug Armstrong, who's the present GM of the St. Louis Blues and who used to be the general manager of the Dallas Stars. I talked to Craig Patrick, who used to be the general manager of the Pittsburgh Penguins and was there when they won their back-to-back cups in the early 90s and actually worked with Team USA when they won the gold medal in 1980. I talked to Doug Wilson, of the present general manager of the San Jose Sharks. Dean Lombardi, who used to be when I talked to him, he was the general manager of the Kings just months before he got fired. Right now he's doing consulting work with the Philadelphia Flyers. I talked to them. I talked to former general managers like Jim Devellano, who built the Red Wings from a last-place team to Stanley Cup champions in the 1990s. Just Scotty Bowman. Both men are in retirement. Jim Rutherford, who right now, two-time, who just general managed the Penguins to two straight Stanley Cups. I interviewed him on Thanksgiving morning in 2016. Great interview. Great guy.
Wow, that's amazing to really be able to talk to these guys and really pick their brains and talk about their experiences. And we have a question from the chat room. Our show is very interactive, and one of the questions is, what traits do they share, the great ones?
Well, Harry Sinden talked about his landmark trade with Emil Francis in 1975 when he sent Phil Esposito to the New York Rangers in exchange for Brad Park. That was an enormous landmark trade, in NHL history at that time. I mean, he basically said both teams were in the doldrums, and they realized we didn't want to do a piddling trade. They needed to do something very big to shake their respective teams up and re-energize them. And the trade was made, and as it turned out, it really helped the Boston Bruins because Bobby Orr was gone. He had gone to free agency to Chicago and only played a bare handful of games in the next 4 years, whereas Brad Park really helped the Bruins defensive core and helped go to 2 straight Stanley Cup Finals appearances in 1977 and 1978. Let's see, another landmark trade I was talking about. Oh man. Trying to think off the top of my head. Man, I'm drawing a blank here. Craig Patrick talked about getting Samuelson, the great was it 1980 Murphy and Samuelson, Shell Samuelson to the Penguins, and he said that was a momentous trade that really helped give energy to the Penguins and help them win those 2 back-to-back cups. Let's see, trying to think. Pierre Lacroix talked about that landmark trade where he stole, Patrick Roy from the Montreal Canadiens, to the Colorado Avalanche. I mean, that was a landmark trade because, Patrick Roy was left out dry in that infamous game where some other team scored like 7 goals and his coach refused to pull him, to help, lower his GAA. And basically Patrick Roy said, I'm never going to play a single minute for you guys again. Patrick Roy was up for grabs, and Pierre Lacroix, who used to be his agent before he became a general manager, he was Patrick Roy's agent, saw the opportunity, got Patrick Roy, and hey, the Colorado Avalanche won 2 Stanley Cups thanks to Patrick Roy. That was a landmark trade.
Yeah, and I think what I'm seeing and what I'm starting to learn is that there's a mixture of both. You need to be able to make trades, you need to be able to do free agency, you need to be able to also work in the draft. And the NHL is one of the toughest because most of the time, they're not immediately going to play. A lot of the times they have to start in the minor leagues, kind of like in baseball. You may not see this kid for 2 to 3 years. So I think to me, being a GM in the NHL is probably one of the toughest because there's so many factors. There's so many things that it's not just sign and trade people. There's a lot more factors to it.
Oh, yeah, but sometimes it's not so much making the key trade. I mean, Lou Lamoriello, when I was interviewing him, a great interview, he told me, you know what my greatest trades were? He said some of my greatest trades were the trades I did not make. In other words, I decided not to pull the trigger and make the trade. I could have made the trade, he said, but I chose not to make the trade. So that's a factor, too, that needs to be weighed, when to pull the trigger and when not to pull the trigger. And that's an art form in its own right. And also, it's being able to utilize your staff. Like I interviewed Neil Smith, who was the general manager of the New York Rangers when they won the Stanley Cup in 1994. Before he became the GM of the Rangers, he was a bright young aide under Jim Devellano at the Detroit Red Wings. I think he was like their head of scouting. And he talked about he discovered Nicholas Lidstrom, the great defenseman of the Red Wings there, who's now in the Hockey Hall of Fame. And he discovered him, up there in Sweden, Sweden or something like that. And no one really knew about him, but he discovered him, and he said it took a lot of hard work convincing Jim Devellano to say, we got to draft this kid. We got to draft him. He's going to be a great one. And at first he said Jimmy D was a little bit hesitant, but finally he gave, Neil Smith the code and said, okay, we're going to draft this kid. And boom, he became one of the greatest defensemen in the history of the NHL. I mean, just trusting in your subordinates. When I interviewed Brian Burke, we talked about Pat Quinn and how they got Pavel Bure with the Vancouver Canucks. I mean, they took an enormous risk because at the time people thought Bure in '89 was not eligible for the draft. Or was it '89 or '90? He was not eligible to draft because he hadn't played the requisite number of games. But Brian Burke told me that they did aggressive investigation in Russia, and actually they had to pay off a couple of people to get the necessary information. And so when they drafted him in the 6th round, everyone was like, no, you can't do that. But hey, they had the documented proofs that showed that Bure had played the requisite number of games. And in fact, here's a great hockey what if. The Canucks were not the only team hot after Pavel Bure. The Edmonton Oilers were hot on his trail too, because they had the same information. And if Vancouver hadn't drafted Bure, Edmonton was going to get him. So can you imagine Pavel Bure playing alongside Mark Messier? They might have gotten an extra cup out of that. So that's a great what if.
Right, exactly. And we got another question from the chat room. Togo, he says, do you feel ex-players make the best GMs?
Ooh.
Good question.
Well, Pierre Lacroix was not a player. He was just a player agent. And yet, in my view, why he's not in the Hockey Hall of Fame after all the great work he did in making the Colorado Avalanche 2-time Stanley Cup champions in a 10-year period, I don't know why. I mean, he was just a player agent. Stan Bowman never played a minute in the NHL, yet he managed 3 Stanley Cup winners with the Chicago Blackhawks. Although this past season they didn't finish in the playoffs. So no, that's not the real sole criteria for being a great general manager. I mean, Lou Lamoriello, I don't think he never played in the NHL. I mean, he basically coached in NCAA hockey, helped create the Eastern Conference, in NCAA hockey. In fact, he was Hall of Fame material even before he took over the New Jersey Devils. His name in history was already written because of his great work in NCAA hockey. But he wasn't a player, so no, it's not the sole criterion for greatness.
Yeah. And another question here we have. What do you feel is more important? And talking to the GM's character or talent.
Oh boy, I think it's the character issue, because when I talked to him, the common theme I was always getting was absolute dedication to the team, the right mental attitude, dedication to winning. In other words, we are committed to making this team a winner. I mean, total commitment to the team. I mean, when I was talking to Doug Armstrong, he worked under Bobby Clark when Bobby Clark was GM of what was then the Minnesota North Stars, and he raved about Clark's absolute total focus to winning and making the franchise a winner. And Dean Lombardi, when he was working for the Flyers in the early 2000s after he got fired at San Jose, he raved about Clark's absolute focus to helping the Flyers become winners, contenders, and champions. I think it's character. You're getting the right personalities. I mean, Jim Devellano, they created a winning culture there in Detroit. You notice there were no horrible controversies, all that, because they were getting the right guys, the right players who just, the only focus was on winning, not unselfishness, total character. I figured the idea was, mental stability and quality. If you had that winning attitude and that winning character, then the talent would take care of itself.
Right. And I agree with that. I think around sports, period, if you have the high character guy seems to be the guy that stays on the team the longest. The guy that stays on the team, the guy that the GM and the coach are loyal to. If you just have talent and you're a low character guy, you go from team to team to team, because people can only deal with you for so long, and then they gotta end up shipping you out somewhere else. Yeah. I mean, I was talking to 2 old St. Louis Blues, Bernie Federico and Brian Sutter. They talked about the late Ron Caron, who was the GM of the St. Louis Blues during the 80s, when the Blues almost had folded their tent and they almost moved to Saskatoon. I mean, during the 80s, they were literally playing on a shoestring, and they really couldn't draft that much, and sometimes they had to sell some of their best players to other teams just to pay the bills and all that. And yet Federico and Sutter stayed through, it was like years, throughout the whole decade. It was like the Valley Forge, and yet they stuck together because they had character, because then no matter what, we have each other, and we're going to keep playing these games, and we're going to do the best we can. And they always made the playoffs, but they never won a Stanley Cup. Right. Another question, Vince Wright, who lives in Minnesota, he said he's snowed in right now. I think he said it's 5 degrees, but he's a big hockey fan. He wanted to ask about Lou Nan. He said the old North Stars GM and player. I don't know. I don't think he's on the list, but what